Mason Duarte knew what it felt like to be invisible, the single father working overtime just to keep the lights on, watching his 8-year-old daughter outgrow her shoes faster than he could afford new ones. When his great-uncle died and left him an old garage, everyone in town laughed at the poor mechanic who'd inherited what looked like a pile of junk. But Mason was wrong. While fixing a leaky roof, he found a hidden room filled with classic cars worth $175 million. Ferrari after Ferrari, a prototype Shelby, even a rare 1938 Bugatti Al, perfectly preserved and waiting. The discovery made him rich overnight, but it also brought vultures circling. Developers wanted his land, collectors wanted his cars, and the town wanted their cut. The real question wasn't how the cars got there, but why his uncle had hidden them, instead of selling them to save their struggling town. What Mason discovers about his uncle's true plan will shock you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung low over Iron Ridge like a shroud, clinging to the empty lot where the steel mill used to stand. Mason Duarte pulled his rusted Ford pickup into the driveway of his rental house, the engine coughing its familiar protest, before finally surrendering to silence. Through the cracked windshield, he could see Leah's face pressed against the living room window, her breath fogging the glass as she waited for him to come inside. At 32, Mason carried the weight of a man twice his age. His shoulders were permanently hunched from years of bending over car engines, and his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The lines around his eyes came not from laughter but from squinting at repair manuals by the light of a single bare bulb, stretching every dollar until it screamed. "Daddy!" Leah burst through the front door before he could even turn off the ignition, her small arms wrapping around his legs with the fierce intensity that only 8-year-olds possess. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo he bought on sale 3 bottles at a time, and her dark hair so much like her mother Swa's, pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. "Hey there, little mechanic," Mason said, scooping her up despite the protest from his aching back. "What did you build today?" Leah's eyes lit up the way they always did when she talked about her projects. She was forever constructing elaborate worlds from cardboard boxes and duct tape, creating castles and spaceships and magical kingdoms from whatever scraps she could find. "I made a garage for my toy cars," she announced proudly. "It has a secret room where the special cars live." Mason's throat tightened. Even at 8, Leah understood that some things were too precious to display openly. He carried her inside their small rental house, noting the way the floorboards creaked under his feet and how the afternoon light revealed every crack in the plaster walls. The living room was small but tidy, furnished with a couch he'd bought second-hand and a coffee table Leah had helped him build from salvaged wood. "Show me," he said, settling her down on the worn carpet. Leah disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a shoebox that had been transformed into an elaborate garage. She'd cut doorways and windows, painted the walls with watercolors, and even added tiny details like a miniature air compressor made from a bottle cap and some string. Inside, carefully arranged on cotton batting, were her prized possessions, a collection of die-cast cars she'd accumulated over the years, each one a birthday or Christmas gift treasured beyond measure. "See," she said, lifting a section of the box to reveal a hidden compartment underneath. "The really special cars live down here where nobody can hurt them." Mason stared at the tiny hidden garage, something stirring in his chest. "That's beautiful, Leah. Really beautiful. Mrs. Henderson says imagination is just poor people's television," Leah said matter-of-factly, arranging her cars with the careful precision of a curator. "But I think it's better than television, because you can make anything happen." Mrs. Henderson lived next door, and had made it her mission to remind Mason and Leah of their place in Iron Ridge's social hierarchy. She was the self-appointed keeper of the town's respectability, a woman who measured worth by the newness of your car and the size of your house. Mason had learned to ignore her comments, but it pained him that Leah had to hear them. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't know what she's talking about," Mason said firmly. Imagination is one of the most valuable things a person can have. Iron Ridge had once been a thriving industrial town, the kind of place where 3 generations of a family might work at the same factory, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where a man could support his family with honest work and a strong back. The steel mill had employed nearly half the town's population, and the surrounding businesses, diners, hardware stores, barber shops had thrived on the steady wages it provided. But that was before the mill closed 5 years ago, taking with it not just jobs, but the town's sense of identity. Now Iron Ridge was a collection of empty storefronts and for sale signs, a place where young people left as soon as they graduated, and older folks hung on out of stubbornness or simple inability to go anywhere else. Mason had stayed because of Leah, because her mother Sarah had roots here, because moving required money he didn't have. He'd opened his one-man repair shop in a converted garage on the edge of town, surviving on oil changes and brake jobs, always one missed payment away from losing everything. The townspeople tolerated him because they needed someone to fix their cars, but they never let him forget that he was different. Mason had grown up in California, the product of a broken home and a series of foster families. He'd learned about engines not from his father but from a gruff mechanic named Pete, who'd taken pity on a teenage kid with nowhere else to go. When Sarah brought him to Iron Ridge 8 years ago, pregnant and hopeful, he'd tried to fit in, but small towns have long memories and little patience for outsiders. Sarah had died in a car accident when Leah was 3, leaving Mason to navigate single parenthood in a place where he'd never quite belonged. The town's sympathy had been genuine but brief, and now he was simply the guy who fixed their cars and raised his daughter quietly on the margins of their community. "Daddy, are you sad?" Leah asked, studying his face with the unsettling perceptiveness of children. "Just thinking," Mason said, forcing a smile. "How about we make some dinner?" Their kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people, but Mason had learned to be efficient. He pulled ingredients from the refrigerator: ground beef that was on sale, pasta, a jar of sauce he'd stretched with extra tomatoes. Leah sat at the small table, working on homework while he cooked, her pencil moving carefully across the page. "We're learning about family trees in school," she said without looking up. "I need to write about our relatives." Mason's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. Leah's family tree was sparse. Sarah's parents had died before she was born, and Mason's own family history was a patchwork of abandonment and loss. The only blood relative he could claim was his great-uncle Edgar, Sarah's grandfather's brother, and the man was practically a ghost. "Tell me about great-uncle Edgar again," Leah said, as if reading his thoughts. Mason had met Edgar exactly twice in his life. The first time was at Sarah's funeral, where the old man had stood at the back of the church like a shadow, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement before disappearing. The second time was 3 years later, when Edgar had shown up at Mason's garage, unannounced, driving a pristine 1960 Thunderbird that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. "He's your great-great-uncle, actually," Mason said, stirring the sauce. "Sarah's grandfather's brother. He must be in his 80s by now." "What does he do?" "I'm not really sure. He owns some kind of old garage out on Route 47, but I've never seen it open. Your mom used to say he was always a bit of a mystery, even when she was growing up." Edgar had been polite but distant during that second visit, spending an hour walking around Mason's shop, examining his tools and asking careful questions about his work. He'd seemed impressed by Mason's skill but had said little about himself. When he left, he'd pressed a business card into Mason's hand. "Edgar Duarte, Automotive Restoration," but the phone number had been disconnected when Mason tried to call. "Maybe he's like a secret agent," Leah suggested, her imagination already spinning stories around the mysterious uncle. "Maybe," Mason agreed, though he suspected the truth was far more mundane. Edgar was probably just another old man clinging to the past, keeping his garage as a monument to better times. After dinner, Mason helped Leah with her homework, while she chatted about her day at school. She was too bright, sometimes, and Mason worried about her future in a town that offered so little opportunity. He'd started a small college fund, adding a few dollars whenever he could, but at the current rate, It would take 20 years to accumulate enough for even a community college education. Mrs. Patterson says I should try out for the academic team, Leah said, looking up from her math worksheet. But I told her I'd rather work on cars with you. Mason's chest tightened. You should try out for the team, sweetheart. You're smart enough to do anything you want. But I like cars. And I like working with my hands like you do. There was nothing wrong with working with your hands. But Mason wanted more for his daughter. He wanted her to have choices. To see the world beyond Iron Ridge's shrinking borders. He wanted her to never know the particular humiliation of counting quarters to buy milk, or the weight of knowing that everyone in town saw you as something less than worthy. You can like cars and still be on the academic team, he said gently. You can do both. Leah considered this with the seriousness of a judge. Okay, but I still want to help in the garage. Deal. Later, after Leah had gone to bed, Mason sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the monthly bills spread before him. The numbers were unforgiving. Rent, utilities, groceries, Leah's school supplies. Insurance, each item chipped away at his modest income, until there was nothing left for savings or emergencies, or small luxuries like new shoes when the old ones wore out. The knock on his door came at 9:30. Just as he was considering whether he could stretch the car insurance payment another week. Mason opened the door to find a young woman in a business suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, a briefcase in her hand. Mr. Duarte, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Walsh Associates. I'm here about your great-uncle Edgar. Mason's stomach dropped. In his experience, lawyers brought only bad news. What about him? I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Mr. Edgar Duarte passed away last week. I'm here to discuss his will. The words hit Mason like a physical blow. He'd barely known Edgar, but the old man had been his only connection to Sarah's family, the only link to something larger than his small, struggling existence. I'm sorry for your loss, the lawyer continued, but I think you'll find that Mr. Duarte left you something significant. Mason invited her in, glancing toward Leah's bedroom to make sure she was still sleeping. He cleared the bills from the table and offered the lawyer a seat. Your great-uncle was quite specific in his instructions, Jennifer said, opening her briefcase and withdrawing a thick folder. He's left you his property on Route 47, the garage, and the land it sits on. Mason stared at the legal documents, trying to process what he was hearing. The garage? Yes. According to his will, he wanted you to have it because, and I quote, the boy understands what it means to fix things that are broken. Mason felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, though whether from relief or hysteria, he couldn't tell. Edgar's garage, the mysterious, always closed garage, that probably hadn't seen a customer in decades. It was generous, he supposed. But what was he supposed to do with a second garage when he could barely keep his first one running? There's more, Jennifer continued, pulling out a set of keys. Mr. Duarte also left specific instructions about what you're to do with the property. He wanted you to read this letter before you visit the garage. She handed him an envelope, yellowed with age, his name written on the front in Edgar's careful script. Mason turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of something more than paper. I should probably mention, Jennifer said, gathering her documents, that the property comes with some outstanding debts, tax liens primarily. You'll need to address those within 90 days, or risk losing the property. Mason's brief hope deflated like a punctured tire. Of course there were debts. There were always debts. After the lawyer left, Mason sat in his kitchen holding Edgar's letter, afraid to open it. Outside, Iron Ridge slept under its blanket of fog, a town full of people who had written him off long ago. Tomorrow, they would probably laugh at him for inheriting what they assumed was just another burden. But tonight, for just a moment, Mason allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, Edgar had left him something more than an old building and a pile of bills. Maybe he'd left him a chance. He opened the envelope and began to read. Edgar's letter was brief, written in the same careful script that had addressed the envelope. Mason, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably wondering what to do with an old man's garage. Don't let them tear it down. There's more here than meets the eye. Look for the brass key taped under the third workbench drawer. When you find what I've hidden, remember that some treasures are meant to be shared, not sold. The town needs what I've saved. You'll understand when you see it. Trust your instincts, boy. You've got good hands and a good heart. Edgar. Mason read the letter 3 times before setting it down on his kitchen table. The words were cryptic, almost nonsensical, but something in Edgar's tone suggested this wasn't the rambling of an old man. Edgar had been precise in life. Mason remembered that much from their brief encounters. Every word would have been chosen carefully. The next morning, Mason dropped Leah off at school and drove out to Route 47. Edgar's garage sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by weeds and overshadowed by old oak trees. The building itself was larger than Mason remembered, a long, low structure with 4 service bays and what looked like office space at one end. The paint was faded but not peeling, and the roof appeared solid despite its age. Mason parked his truck and walked around the building, noting details he'd missed during Edgar's funeral reception, when he'd only glimpsed the place from the road. The garage had been built in the 1950s, judging by its design, but someone had maintained it carefully over the years. The windows were clean, the gutters clear of debris, and the overhead doors moved smoothly when he tested them. Inside, the garage was spotless. 4 service bays equipped with hydraulic lifts, tool chests that would have made any mechanic envious, and workbenches that had been organized with military precision. Mason ran his hand along one of the workbenches, feeling the smooth wear patterns left by decades of use. This wasn't an abandoned garage, this was a shrine to automotive craftsmanship. The third workbench was near the back wall, and Mason knelt to examine its drawers. The top 2 slid open easily, revealing carefully organized tools and parts. The third drawer stuck slightly, and when Mason pulled harder, he felt something shift. Reaching underneath, his fingers found a small piece of tape, holding something metallic. The brass key was old but well maintained, about 3 inches long with an ornate head that suggested it belonged to something important. Mason turned it over in his palm, wondering what Edgar had wanted him to find. There were no obvious locks in the garage, no safe or storage room that would require such a key. He spent the next hour exploring every corner of the building, looking for anything that might need unlocking. The office space contained a desk, filing cabinets, and a bookshelf full of automotive manuals, but nothing that required Edgar's mysterious key. Mason was beginning to think the old man's instructions were the product of a failing mind when he noticed something odd about the back wall. The concrete block construction was consistent throughout the garage, except for one section near the rear corner. There, the blocks were a slightly different shade, as if they'd been added later. Mason pressed against the wall and felt the slightest give, as if there was space behind it. He retrieved a flashlight from his truck and examined the wall more carefully. What he'd taken for slight color variation was actually the outline of a door, so perfectly fitted that it was nearly invisible. Running his hands along the edges, Mason found a small keyhole hidden behind a loose block at shoulder height. The brass key slid in smoothly, and Mason heard the distinct click of tumblers falling into place. When he pushed, a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a passageway that led down into darkness. Mason's heart pounded as he shone his flashlight into the passage. Stone steps led down about 10 feet to what appeared to be a larger space. The air that drifted up was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of leather and metal polish. He descended carefully, one hand on the stone wall for balance. At the bottom of the steps, his flashlight beam swept across something that made him gasp and nearly lose his footing. Cars. Row upon row of automobiles, each one covered by a fitted cloth cover, arranged in perfect lines in what had to be an underground garage larger than the building above. Mason's light played across the shapes, revealing elegant curves and distinctive silhouettes that spoke of automotive artistry from bygone eras. He found a light switch near the entrance and flipped it, flooding the space with warm fluorescent light. What he saw took his breath away completely. The underground garage was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the building above, carved from the earth and lined with moisture-proof materials. Climate control units hummed quietly in the corners, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity. The floor was polished concrete, and the ceiling was supported by steel beams that spoke of serious engineering. But it was the cars that made Mason's knees weak. He approached the nearest vehicle and carefully lifted the cover, revealing a pristine Ferrari 250 GT, its red paint gleaming as if it had just left the factory. The next cover revealed a silver Porsche 356, followed by a black Mercedes 300 SL with its distinctive gullwing doors. Mason moved from car to car in a daze, each reveal more stunning than the last. A 1938 Bugatti, Type 57 Atlantic, its aluminum body, hand-formed and polished to a mirror finish. A prototype Shelby Daytona coupe that Mason was certain existed only in automotive legend. A 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing that looked like it had never been driven. A Ferrari 250 GTO that collectors would kill for. Mason counted 37 vehicles in total, each one a masterpiece of automotive engineering and artistry. Some he recognized from magazine articles and auction catalogs, legendary cars that sold for millions of dollars. Others were so rare he'd never seen their like, one-off prototypes and custom builds that represented the pinnacle of their maker's craft. Near the back of the collection, Mason found a small office space with a desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered with photographs, documentation, and what appeared to be provenance records for each vehicle. A leather-bound ledger lay open on the desk, and Mason flipped through pages of Edgar's careful notations: purchase dates, restoration notes, maintenance records. The final entry was dated just 6 months ago. Collection complete. 37 vehicles, total estimated value, $175 million. Time to prepare for the transfer. Mason sank into Edgar's chair, the number echoing in his head. $175 million. More money than he could comprehend. More than Iron Ridge had probably seen in its entire history. He owned a collection worth more than some small country's GDP. But why? Why had Edgar hidden this treasure, instead of selling even one car to live comfortably? Why had he let the town struggle and die while sitting on a fortune that could have saved it? Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Leah's school. She was feeling sick and needed to be picked up. He locked the hidden garage carefully, his mind reeling as he drove back to town. Every familiar sight, the closed storefronts, the rusted for sale signs, the people walking with the hunched shoulders of those who'd given up, hope took on new meaning. He had the power to change everything. With just one car from Edgar's collection, he could pay off every debt in town, reopen the businesses, bring back the jobs. He could give Leah the future she deserved, send her to any college she wanted, buy her a house in a neighborhood where children's dreams weren't limited by their parents' empty bank accounts. But Edgar's letter nagged at him. Some treasures are meant to be shared, not sold. What had the old man meant? And why did Mason have the feeling that the real mystery was just beginning? As he pulled into the school parking lot, Mason caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The grease-stained mechanic was still there, but something had changed in his eyes. For the first time in years, Mason Duarte looked like a man with possibilities. Mason spent the weekend researching classic car values online, his laptop growing warm from hours of constant use. Each search result made his head spin more. The 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing alone, the crown jewel of Edgar's collection, was worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million at current market prices. A single car worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Leah recovered from her stomach bug by Sunday and found Mason surrounded by printouts and browser tabs, his coffee growing cold as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd inherited. "Daddy, you look like you saw a ghost," she said, climbing onto his lap and peering at the laptop screen, showing a pristine Ferrari 250 GTO. "Maybe I did, sweetheart." Mason closed the laptop gently. "Tell me, what would you do if you found buried treasure?" Leah considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. I'd share it with people who needed it, like in the stories you read me, where the pirates always end up helping the village. Out of the mouths of babes. Mason hugged her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. What if sharing it was complicated? What if there were rules about what you could and couldn't do with it? Then I'd figure out the rules first, Leah said pragmatically. Mrs. Patterson says you should always understand the rules before you play the game. Monday morning brought Mason's first visitor regarding the inheritance. Ellie Park knocked on his garage door at 7:30, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the slightly anxious expression of someone about to ask a favor. Mason knew Ellie by sight. She was the town librarian, about his age, with intelligent brown eyes and prematurely gray hair she wore in a practical ponytail. They'd gone to high school together briefly, though she'd been in advanced classes while he'd spent most of his time in shop. She'd also been one of the few people who'd attended Sarah's funeral without being obligated by work or social convention. I hope you don't mind me bothering you, she said, offering him the coffee. I heard about Edgar's garage, and I was wondering if you might need some help with the historical research. Mason accepted the coffee gratefully. Historical research? For the estate, property that old, especially with Edgar's reputation, there might be documentation you'd want to preserve. Family papers, business records, things that could be important for whatever you decide to do with the place. There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Mason studied her face, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact. What do you know about Edgar? He asked. Ellie relaxed slightly, as if she'd been hoping he'd ask. More than most people, probably. I've been the town historian for the last 5 years, and Edgar's name comes up a lot in the old records. He was involved in things here that most people have forgotten. What kind of things? Community development mainly. Back in the 60s and 70s, when the mill was still running strong, Edgar donated money for the vocational school, the library expansion, even helped fund the Little League fields. But he always did it quietly, anonymously. Most people never knew where the money came from. Mason felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. He had money back then, enough to make a difference, but then something changed in the early 80s. The donations stopped, and Edgar became more reclusive. People assumed his business had failed, but the property taxes kept getting paid, utilities stayed on. He was still there, just hidden. Ellie stepped closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the garage. Mason, I think Edgar was planning something. Something big. I've found references in old town meeting minutes. Fragments of conversations about a future fund, or a legacy project. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me think he didn't just disappear. He was waiting. Waiting for what? Maybe for the right person to inherit what he'd built. Someone who'd understand his vision. Mason set down his coffee cup, decision crystallizing in his mind. Would you like to see what Edgar left me? The drive to Edgar's garage was quiet, Ellie staring out the window at the familiar landmarks of a town that had forgotten how to hope. When Mason led her through the hidden door and down into the underground collection, her gasp echoed off the concrete walls. Dear Lord, she whispered, moving from car to car with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. Mason, do you understand what this is? A lot of money. It's a museum. Look at the selection. These aren't just expensive cars. They represent different eras, different innovations in automotive design. The Bugatti Atlantic, there are only 4 in existence. The Shelby prototype, that's part of racing history. The Mercedes Gullwing, that revolutionized sports car design. Ellie moved to Edgar's desk and began examining the documentation with practiced efficiency. Look at this, she said, holding up a folder. Provenance papers, insurance documents, maintenance records. Edgar didn't just collect these cash, preserve them. This is a complete historical archive. Mason joined her at the desk, watching as she spread out photographs and documents. Many of the pictures showed Edgar with the cars, but younger Edgar in his 40s and 50s, working on engines, polishing chrome, attending car shows and racing events. He was serious about this, Ellie continued. Look at these insurance policies. Every car is insured for its full market value, premiums paid up for the next decade. Edgar wasn't hiding these cars because he was broke, was protecting them. But from what? Ellie pointed to a newspaper clipping tucked into one of the folders, dated 1982. The headline read, "Local car collection targeted by thieves." The article described a break-in at a private garage in the next county, where several rare vehicles had been stolen and apparently sold overseas to private collectors. Edgar would have read this, Ellie said. Maybe that's when he decided to build the underground garage. Maybe he realized that keeping the cars visible made them vulnerable. Mason found himself studying a photograph of Edgar, standing next to the Mercedes 300 SL, both man and machine gleaming in bright sunlight. Edgar looked proud but also somehow sad, as if he understood that beauty this pure couldn't exist in the open world without being corrupted or destroyed. "There's something else," Ellie said, pulling out a manila envelope marked Iron Ridge Economic Development Confidential. Inside were architectural drawings, economic projections, and what appeared to be plans for transforming Edgar's garage into some kind of educational facility. "A Heritage Automotive Institute," Mason read from one of the documents, "teaching traditional restoration techniques while preserving automotive history for future generations." Edgar was going to turn this into a school, Ellie realized. Train people in traditional crafts, bring tourism to the town, create jobs that couldn't be shipped overseas. The car collection wasn't his treasure, it was his curriculum. Mason sank into Edgar's chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Edgar hadn't been a reclusive collector, he'd been a visionary, planning for a future that would honor the past while creating opportunities for people like Mason and his neighbors. But why didn't he do it himself? Mason asked. Why wait? Ellie was quiet for a long moment, studying another document. Maybe he knew he didn't have the right skills. Edgar was a collector, a preservationist. But this kind of project would need someone who could actually teach people to work with their hands. Someone who understood what it meant to struggle, to build something from nothing. Their eyes met across Edgar's desk, and Mason felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar tool belt. Edgar hadn't just left him a fortune, he'd left him a mission. News traveled fast in a town the size of Iron Ridge. By Tuesday morning, half the diner was buzzing with rumors about Mason's inheritance, and by Wednesday, the first vultures had begun circling. Mason was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Honda when he heard the expensive car pull up outside his garage. He emerged to find a man in his 50s climbing out of a black BMW, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his suit probably worth more than Mason made in a month. "Mr. Duarte, I'm Richard Pemberton from Pemberton Classic Automotive." The man extended a manicured hand. "I represent several serious collectors who are very interested in your recent acquisition." Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag before shaking. "I'm not sure what you mean." Pemberton's smile was the practiced expression of someone who made his living convincing people to part with valuable things. "Come now, Mr. Duarte, word gets around in our community. Edgar Duarte was known to serious collectors, even if he never sold anything. We know he had quite a collection, and we're prepared to make you a very generous offer. I haven't decided what I'm doing with the property yet." Of course. But consider this, maintaining a collection of that caliber requires significant expertise and resources. Insurance alone must be costing you thousands per month. Storage, climate control, security, these things add up quickly. Better to sell to people who can properly appreciate what Edgar assembled. Pemberton pulled out a business card and a folder thick with documentation. "I've taken the liberty of preparing some preliminary valuations based on what we believe Edgar owned. Conservative estimates, mind you, but we're talking about $40 to $50 million minimum. My clients are prepared to offer $60 million for the entire collection, cash, with immediate transfer. No fuss, no complications." Mason glanced at the folder without opening it. $60 million was more money than he'd ever dreamed of, enough to set up Leah for life, and still have enough left over to help the town. But something about Pemberton's eagerness made him cautious. "I'll need time to think about it." "Naturally. But don't wait too long, Mr. Duarte. Markets for these vehicles can be volatile, and my clients won't keep their offer open indefinitely. After Pemberton left, Mason found he couldn't concentrate on Mrs. Patterson's Honda. The man's offer kept echoing in his head, $60 million for Edgar's cars. It was a fortune beyond imagining, enough to solve every problem he'd ever had. So why did he feel like he'd just been offered 30 pieces of silver? Thursday brought a different kind of visitor. Mason was closing up for the day when a white van pulled up, followed by a pickup truck loaded with surveying equipment. 3 men in work clothes got out, along with a woman in a business suit, who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Mr. Duarte, I'm Amanda Chen from Horizon Development Group. We understand you've inherited some property on Route 47. Mason nodded warily. The surveying equipment was making him nervous. We're always looking for development opportunities in communities like Iron Ridge, Chen continued. Rural areas with good highway access but depressed property values. Your uncle's property is particularly interesting because of its size and location. Interesting how? Chen smiled the same predatory smile Mason had seen on Pemberton's face. The land is perfect for a shopping complex. Big box stores, chain restaurants, maybe a discount hotel. We could bring hundreds of jobs to Iron Ridge, really revitalize the community. And the garage would have to go, unfortunately. But we're prepared to offer you fair market value for the entire property building and land. $2 million, immediate closing. Mason thought about Edgar's careful preservation of automotive history, his plans for an educational institute, his vision of a future that honored the past. The building has historical significance. I'm sure it does, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. $2 million would set you up for life, Mr. Duarte. You could move somewhere with better opportunities for your daughter. She's school-aged, isn't she? Kids need good schools, safe neighborhoods. The implied threat made Mason's jaw clench. I'll need to think about it. Of course, but like I told your friend yesterday, these opportunities don't last forever. Market conditions change, zoning issues arise. Better to take a sure thing while it's on the table. After they left, Mason sat in his truck in the parking lot of Edgar's garage, watching the sun set through the old oak trees. In 2 days, he'd been offered enough money to transform his life. First $60 million for the cars, now $2 million for the property. Either offer would solve his immediate problems and give him financial security beyond his wildest dreams. But accepting either offer would mean destroying Edgar's vision, breaking up the collection, erasing the carefully preserved history that the old man had spent decades assembling. It would mean admitting that everything in Iron Ridge was for sale to the highest bidder. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The display showed a number he didn't recognize. Mason, this is Tom Bradley. I used to work at the mill with your Sarah's dad. Mason remembered Tom, a quiet man with gentle hands, who'd been a foreman before the mill closed. Hi, Tom. How are you holding up? Well enough. Listen, I heard about your inheritance, and I wanted to call before you heard this from someone else. There's talk around town. Some folks are saying you hit the lottery, that you're sitting on millions of dollars while the rest of us struggle. Mason's stomach sank. Tom, it's not that simple. I know it's not, son. That's why I'm calling. See, I remember Edgar from way back. Good man, always helped people who needed it. And I remember your Sarah too. She had a good heart, just like her great uncle. I figure if Edgar left you something valuable, he had his reasons. I'm trying to figure out what those reasons were. Well, you might want to figure it out fast. There's a town meeting called for Saturday night. Official topic is community development opportunities, but what they really want to talk about is your garage and what you plan to do with it. Mason thanked Tom and hung up, his mind racing. A town meeting meant public pressure, formal demands, probably lawyers and politicians getting involved. It meant the end of his ability to make decisions quietly, to honor Edgar's wishes without interference. He thought about Leah, asleep in her bed, with her shoebox garage full of toy cars. She'd built a secret compartment for the special ones, understanding instinctively that some treasures needed protection from the world's grabbing hands. Edgar had understood that too. He'd built his own secret compartment, hiding something precious, until the right person came along to guard it. The question was whether Mason had the strength to be that person, or whether the pressure would force him to do what everyone expected, sell everything and run. As he drove home through Iron Ridge's empty streets, Mason made his decision. Saturday night's meeting would determine not just his future, but the future of everything Edgar had worked to preserve. It was time to find out what kind of man he really was. Friday morning brought Mason's most unwelcome visitor yet. Colt Harrington arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, like a presidential motorcade rolling into Iron Ridge's modest downtown. The man himself emerged from the lead vehicle, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Mason was in his garage, trying to focus on work, while his mind churned over tomorrow night's town meeting, when the convoy pulled up outside. Through his grimy windows, he watched Harrington survey the neighborhood with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "Mr. Duarte?" Harrington's voice carried the slight accent of old money and Ivy League schools. "I'm Colt Harrington, managing partner of Harrington Capital Management. I believe we have mutual interests to discuss." Mason set down his wrench and stepped outside, noting how Harrington's security detail positioned themselves strategically around the area. This wasn't a social call, this was a show of force. "I'm not sure we have anything to discuss, Mr. Harrington." Harrington's smile never wavered. "I think you'd be surprised. You see, my firm specializes in distressed asset recovery and strategic liquidation. We help people like yourself maximize the value of unexpected inheritances. People like myself, working class individuals who suddenly find themselves in possession of assets they lack the resources or expertise to properly manage. It's more common than you might think, and it rarely ends well for the inheritor." Mason felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "And you're here to help me avoid that unfortunate fate." "Exactly. I understand you've already received offers from small-time collectors and local developers. Pensions, essentially, compared to what your inheritance is actually worth. My firm represents a consortium of international investors who understand the true scope of what Edgar Duarte assembled." Harrington pulled out a tablet and showed Mason a presentation that made his previous offers look like pocket change. High-resolution photographs of Edgar's cars filled the screen, accompanied by detailed valuations and market analyses. $125 million, Mr. Duarte. That's our opening offer for the complete collection, with bonuses for provenance documentation and related intellectual property. We're prepared to wire 50% to an account of your choosing today, with the balance transferred upon delivery. Mason stared at the numbers, feeling dizzy. More money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, enough to transform Iron Ridge into whatever he wanted it to become. "Of course," Harrington continued, "the offer assumes immediate acceptance and discreet transfer. My clients value privacy, and they prefer to avoid the complications that arise when valuable collections become public knowledge." Complications. Taxes, insurance issues, regulatory oversight. Local governments have a way of finding reasons to complicate private transactions. Better to complete the transfer while you still have clear title and minimal external pressure. Mason understood the implied threat. Harrington knew about tomorrow's town meeting, knew that Mason was about to face public scrutiny and political pressure. Accept the offer now, or risk losing control of the situation entirely. I'll need time to consider it. Harrington's smile became sharp-edged. Of course, but I should mention that my clients have other opportunities under consideration. This offer has a limited window, let's say until Sunday evening. After that, market conditions may require us to reassess our position. After Harrington left, Mason drove out to Edgar's garage with a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. He descended into the underground collection and walked among the cars, trying to understand what Edgar had really intended. Near the back of the collection, Mason found something he'd missed before a large wall cabinet secured with the same type of lock that had protected the hidden entrance. Edgar's brass key opened it easily, revealing shelves of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be original factory blueprints. The blueprints were for the garage itself, dated 1958, showing not just the building above ground, but detailed plans for the underground space. Edgar hadn't added the vault later, he'd designed the entire facility from the beginning with the hidden collection in mind. But it was the photographs that made Mason's hands shake. Dozens of black and white images showing Edgar working alongside other men, all of them wearing the same work clothes and union pins that Mason recognized from old pictures of the steel mill. Edgar hadn't just been a collector, he'd been part of Iron Ridge's working community. One photograph in particular caught Mason's attention. It showed Edgar shaking hands with a group of men in front of the partially constructed garage, all of them smiling broadly. On the back, someone had written, "Groundbreaking for Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Center, May 15, 1958. Edgar Duarte, founder. Dedicated to the working men and women who built America's cars." Mason felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Edgar's garage hadn't been built as a private collection, it had been intended as a public heritage center from the very beginning. The hidden vault was meant to protect the cars until Iron Ridge was ready for them, until someone came along who could fulfill Edgar's original vision. He found more evidence in a folder marked Heritage Center Business Plan. Edgar had outlined everything: educational programs for local students, apprenticeship opportunities in traditional automotive crafts, tourism revenue that would support local businesses. The car collection wasn't just a museum, it was the cornerstone of an economic development plan 50 years in the making. But something had gone wrong. Mason found correspondence from the early 1960s, showing Edgar struggling with local officials who didn't understand his vision. Facing resistance from people who thought a car museum was a waste of resources. The letters grew increasingly frustrated, until finally Edgar made the decision to hide the collection, until circumstances were more favorable. Mason was so absorbed in Edgar's documents that he didn't hear footsteps on the stairs until a voice behind him said, "I wondered when you'd find those." He spun around to see Ellie Park emerging from the stairwell, carrying a cardboard box and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "How did you get in?" "You left the door unlocked. I brought some things I thought you should see." She set down the box and pulled out a thick folder. Town records from the 1950s and 1960s. "I've been going through the archives since we talked, looking for more information about Edgar's plans." Ellie spread out copies of town meeting minutes, newspaper clippings, and official correspondence. Edgar tried to get municipal support for the Heritage Center. He offered to donate the land, fund the construction, even provide ongoing operating expenses. But the town council rejected his proposal. Why? They thought it was impractical. Mayor Hutchinson said Iron Ridge was a working town, not a tourist destination. He couldn't see the economic potential Edgar was trying to show them. Mason studied the meeting minutes, noting the votes and arguments. Edgar had been ahead of his time, trying to create exactly the kind of heritage tourism that now supported dozens of small towns across the country. So he built it anyway, Mason realized. But he hid the cars, because he knew the same people who rejected his public plan would never let him keep them privately. That's what I think. And I think he was waiting for things to change, for new leadership or new attitudes, for someone who would understand what he was trying to accomplish. Ellie moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper even though they were alone. "Mason, there's something else. I think Edgar left clues about how to make his plan work. Look at this." She showed him a business card, tucked into one of Edgar's folders, Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, judge application. On the back, Edgar had written notes about entry requirements, judging criteria, and prize structures. Edgar was planning to enter the Mercedes in the concours. Ellie said, "Look at the prize money for best of show. It's exactly the amount needed to cover the property taxes and startup costs for the Heritage Center." Mason felt his heart racing. Edgar hadn't just hidden the car, she'd left a roadmap for bringing them back into the light, a way to generate the resources needed to fulfill his original vision. But entering the concourse would mean restoring the Mercedes to show condition, Mason said. That's months of work, thousands of dollars in parts and materials. Unless you had help, Ellie said quietly. Unless you could convince some of the old mill workers to join the project. Men like Tom Bradley, who still remember how to work with metal and take pride in craftsmanship. Mason looked around the underground garage, seeing it with new eyes. Not just a collection of valuable cars, but a workshop waiting for skilled hands, a classroom ready for eager students, a foundation for rebuilding everything Iron Ridge had lost. Tomorrow night's town meeting would determine whether Edgar's 50-year plan could finally come to fruition, or whether the cars would be sold off to private collectors who would scatter them to the winds. Mason had less than 24 hours to decide whether he was ready to fight for a dead man's dream. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything in Iron Ridge look even more depressed than usual. Mason woke before dawn, his mind churning with fragments of Edgar's business plan and the weight of decisions that would affect not just his future, but the future of everyone in town. He found Leah in the kitchen, already dressed and eating cereal, while working on a school projector diorama of a medieval castle made from cardboard and colored paper. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing to tiny figures she'd drawn and cut out. "The knights are protecting the treasure in the tower." Mason studied her work, noting the careful attention to detail, the way she'd created multiple layers of defense around the castle's most precious possessions. What happens if the bad guys get past the knights? Then the treasure gets divided up and sold to different kingdoms, Leah said matter-of-factly, and nobody remembers what it was really for. Out of the mouths of babes, again. Mason kissed the top of her head and headed out to Edgar's garage, where he'd arranged to meet Tom Bradley and a few other former mill workers. Tom arrived first, driving a rusted pickup that had seen better decades. Behind him came Ray Kowalski, who'd been the mill's head electrician, and Frank DiMaggio, whose welding skills had once been legendary throughout the valley. All three men moved with the careful gait of workers whose bodies had absorbed decades of hard labor. "Appreciate you coming," Mason said, leading them toward the garage. "What I'm about to show you, it needs to stay between us for now." Tom nodded gravely. "Whatever Edgar left you, it's nobody else's business until you decide it is." Mason led them through the hidden door and down into the underground collection. The men's reactions were immediate and visceral. Ray whistled low under his breath. Frank crossed himself, and Tom just stood there shaking his head in wonder. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Frank whispered, approaching the nearest Ferrari with the reverence of a man entering a cathedral. "Look at the metalwork on that body. Hand-formed, every panel. You don't see craftsmanship like that anymore." Ray was already examining the electrical systems, his practiced eye noting details that would escape most people. "These cars are more than restored, they're preserved. Look at the wiring harnesses, the original components. Edgar didn't just fix these cars, he maintained them in factory condition." Tom walked slowly through the collection, stopping at each vehicle to study its lines and proportions. When he reached the 1955 Mercedes 300 SL, he stopped completely. "I remember this one," he said quietly. "Edgar brought it to the mill parking lot once, back in 78 or 79. Said he was thinking about entering it in some big car show. We all thought he was crazy. Why risk damaging something so beautiful?" "Maybe he wasn't crazy," Mason said. "Maybe he was planning something bigger than any of us understood." He showed them Edgar's business plan, the original blueprints for the Heritage Center, the documents outlining educational programs and economic development strategies. The three men studied the papers with the intensity of engineers reviewing structural plans. "This could work," Ray said finally. "Training programs for automotive electrical systems, heritage restoration techniques. There's a real market for this kind of specialized knowledge." Frank nodded agreement. "Young people today, they know computers, but they don't understand metal, how to shape it, how to make it last." Edgar was talking about preserving skills, not just cars. "But it would take serious work to make it happen," Tom added. "Starting with that Mercedes. If Edgar really planned to enter it in a concourse, it would need a complete restoration. Engine rebuild, interior work, paint correction, hundreds of hours. Mason felt his heart racing. What if we had help? What if some of the other guys from the mill wanted to get involved? The three men exchanged glances, and Mason could see the spark of interest in their eyes. These were craftsmen who'd been forced into retirement by economic circumstances, their skills and knowledge gathering dust while they collected unemployment and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. Who else were you thinking about? Ray asked. Miguel Santoche did all the precision machining at the mill. Bobby Chen, who could rebuild any engine ever made. Maybe some of the younger guys too, people who want to learn traditional skills. Tom was already mentally assembling a team. We'd need parts, tools, workspace. The overhead garage is big enough, but we'd need equipment. Edgar left tools, Mason said. Professional, grade stuff. Some of it I've never seen before. And there's funding, not much, but enough to get started. What about the town meeting tonight? Frank asked. Word is there's going to be pressure to sell everything, take the money and run. Mason felt the weight of Edgar's vision settling on his shoulders like a familiar tool belt. Then we need to show them there's a better way. We need to demonstrate that Edgar's plan can work, that preserving the collection can benefit everyone. They spent the next 2 hours examining the Mercedes in detail, cataloging what needed to be done to bring it to concourse condition. The engine was solid, but would need rebuilding. The interior required new leather, but the framework was intact. The paint was good, but would need correction and polishing to achieve show car standards. 6 months, Tom estimated. Working weekends and evenings. With the right team, we could have her ready for next year's Pebble Beach concourse. And if we win best of show? Mason asked. Prize money covers the tax debt and provides startup capital for the Heritage Center, Ray said, having studied Edgar's financial projections. It's actually a pretty solid business plan. As the men prepared to leave, Tom pulled Mason aside. You know what you're up against tonight, don't you? People are scared, angry about being left behind. They're going to see those cars as their ticket out of poverty, and they won't want to hear about long-term plans or community development. I know. You're going to need allies, people who remember what this town used to be, who still believe it could be something again. Will you be there tonight? Tom smiled, and for a moment, Mason could see the foreman he'd once been, the man who'd guided crews through complex projects and never backed down from a challenge. Wouldn't miss it. And I'll bring some friends. As Mason drove home to pick up Leah for the town meeting, he found himself thinking about Edgar's 1,962 union meeting minutes. The artifact that had revealed the old man's promise to help displaced workers. Edgar had made a commitment 50 years ago, and now it was up to Mason to honor that promise. Tonight would determine whether Edgar's dream died with him, or whether it could finally come to life in the hands of people who understood its true value. Mason just hoped he was strong enough to carry the weight of 50 years of hope. The Iron Ridge Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the mill closure announcement 5 years ago. Every folding chair was occupied, and people stood along the walls, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope, desperation, and barely contained anger. Mason arrived with Leah and Ellie, noting how conversations stopped when they entered, how neighbors who'd known him for years now looked at him with calculating eyes. Mayor Janet Hutchinson called the meeting to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been managing Iron Ridge's decline for the better part of a decade. She was a thin woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair, and the weary expression of someone who'd fought too many losing battles. We're here tonight to discuss recent developments regarding the Edgar Duarte property, she began. As you all know, Mason Duarte has inherited what appears to be a valuable collection of classic automobiles. Given the potential impact on our community, we felt it was important to have an open discussion about next steps. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mason could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the pressure of expectations and resentments building like steam in a boiler. Before we begin, the mayor continued, I'd like to acknowledge that we have visitors tonight. Mr. Colt Harrington from Harrington Capital Management has requested time to address the community about economic development opportunities. Harrington rose from his seat in the front row, his expensive suit making him stand out like a peacock among sparrows. He moved to the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Thank you, Mayor Hutchinson. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight because Iron Ridge represents exactly the kind of opportunity my firm seeks to support. You have a hard-working community, excellent highway access, and now, thanks to Mr. Duarte's inheritance, the capital resources to transform your economic future. Harrington clicked a remote, and a portable screen displayed a polished presentation showing artists' renderings of shopping centers, office complexes, and residential developments. My clients are prepared to purchase Mr. Duarte's automotive collection for $125 million, he announced, and the room erupted in gasps and excited chatter. That's enough money to revitalize your entire downtown, attract new businesses, create hundreds of jobs. Mason felt his stomach clench as he watched his neighbors' faces light up with hope. $125 million would solve everyone's problems, pay off every debt, give every family a chance at a better future. Of course, Harrington continued, such an investment would require certain commitments from the community. Zoning changes to accommodate modern commercial development, infrastructure improvements, tax incentives to attract retailers and employers. What about the garage? Called out Mrs. Henderson from the back of the room. What happens to Edgar's building? Unfortunately, the existing structure wouldn't be compatible with modern development standards. But we're prepared to include building demolition and site preparation in our overall investment package. Mason stood up, his heart pounding. I haven't agreed to sell the collection. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He could see disappointment and anger beginning to replace hope on his neighbors' faces. Mason, Mayor Hutchinson said carefully, I think we all understand this is a big decision, but you need to consider what's best for the entire community, not just your own interests. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, Mason replied, but I don't think selling the collection is the answer. Harrington's smile became predatory. Mr. Duarte, I understand you're emotionally attached to your inheritance. But surely you can see that keeping 37 cars in a garage doesn't serve anyone's interests. These vehicles need to be in the hands of collectors who can properly preserve and display them. They're already properly preserved, Mason said. Edgar spent 50 years maintaining them in perfect condition, and as for display, he always intended them to be displayed here in Iron Ridge. Mason pulled out Edgar's original business plan and moved toward the podium. Harrington reluctantly stepped aside, but his expression made it clear this was temporary. Edgar didn't build that garage as a private collection, Mason announced to the room. He built it as the foundation for an automotive heritage center, designed to bring tourism and education to Iron Ridge while preserving traditional manufacturing skills. He outlined Edgar's plan for educational programs, the apprenticeship opportunities, the economic development strategy that would create sustainable jobs rather than temporary construction work. This is all very idealistic, Mayor Hutchinson interrupted, but Mr. Harrington is offering real money today. Edgar's plan is 50 years old, Mason. Times have changed. Have they? Tom Bradley stood up from his seat near the middle of the room. Because I'm looking around this room, and I see the same hard-working people who were here 50 years ago. The same families who built this town with their hands and their skills. Ray Kowalski and Frank DiMaggio stood as well, followed by several other former mill workers. Mason felt a surge of gratitude his allies were making themselves known. Edgar knew something the rest of us forgot, Tom continued. He knew that our skills, our knowledge, our tradition of craftsmanship, that's our real wealth. Not something to be sold off to the highest bidder, but something to be preserved and passed on. That's very noble, said Mrs. Henderson. But nobility doesn't pay the bills. My property taxes have doubled in 5 years, and my house is worth half what I paid for it. I need real solutions, not fairy tales about heritage centers. The crowd murmured agreement, and Mason felt his support beginning to erode. Harrington sensed the shift and moved back toward the podium. "Mrs. Henderson raises an excellent point," he said. "Community development requires pragmatic thinking, not romantic notions about the past." That's when Ellie Park stood up, holding a manila folder Mason hadn't seen before. "Actually," she said, in a voice that carried clearly through the room, "Edgar's plan was more pragmatic than any of us realized." She moved to the front of the room and pulled out a document that made Mason's heart skip a beat. It was an insurance policy, yellowed with age, but bearing official seals and signatures. "I found this in the county records office yesterday," Ellie announced. "It's a community insurance policy, taken out by Edgar Duarte in 1963. He insured his entire automotive collection, not for his own benefit, but as a financial guarantee for the town of Iron Ridge." Mason stared at the document, reading the terms with growing amazement. Edgar had structured the insurance so that in the event of his death, the policy would pay out not to his heirs, but to the town itself, contingent on the collection being preserved and displayed for public benefit. "The policy is still active," Ellie continued. "Current value, based on updated appraisals, is $175 million. But it only pays out if the collection remains intact and is used for educational and cultural purposes within Iron Ridge." The room erupted in chaos. People shouted questions, argued among themselves, demanded explanations. Harrington's face had gone pale, and Mayor Hutchinson was frantically flipping through the insurance documents. "This changes everything," the mayor said, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "If Edgar structured this as a community asset, then selling the collection would void the insurance," Ellie finished, "and the town would lose the largest economic development fund in its history." Mason felt the pieces of Edgar's 50-year plan finally clicking into place. The old man hadn't just hidden the cash, he'd legally structured their preservation as the town's financial future. He'd created a situation where doing the right thing was also the profitable thing. Harrington was already moving toward the exit, his expensive suit and confident demeanor no match for the angry stares of people who just realized they'd been offered a fraction of what they were actually entitled to. "This is still theoretical," he said over his shoulder. "Insurance policies can be challenged, legal structures can be changed. Nothing is set in stone." But Mason could see in his neighbors' faces that something had shifted. The desperation was still there, but it was now mixed with possibility, the chance that they could honor their past while building their future, that they could preserve Edgar's legacy while securing their own. As the meeting broke up into smaller groups of excited conversation, Mason found himself surrounded by people asking questions, offering support, volunteering for whatever came next. For the first time since inheriting Edgar's garage, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight alone. "So," Tom Bradley said, clapping Mason on the shoulder, "when do we start restoring that Mercedes?" The Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance entry form arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months after the town meeting that had changed everything. Mason held the official document in his hands, feeling the weight of Edgar's 50-year dream condensed into 3 pages of requirements, deadlines, and judging criteria. The 1,955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing sat in the upper garage, transformed from a preserved museum piece into a gleaming testament to craftsmanship. Every surface had been meticulously restored by hands that understood both the car's history and its importance to Iron Ridge's future. Tom Bradley emerged from under the hood, his face streaked with oil but his eyes bright with satisfaction. At 68, he moved with the careful precision of a master craftsman, every motion economical and purposeful. "Compression readings are perfect," he announced to the small crowd gathered around the Mercedes. Miguel's machine work on the cylinder head was flawless. Miguel Santos, the former mill machinist, beamed with pride. Over the past 8 months, he'd become the project's resident perfectionist, approaching each component with the same attention to detail that had once made him indispensable at the steel mill. "The interior work is finished too. added Bobby Chen, who'd spent 3 months hand-stitching leather seats, using techniques that were becoming extinct in an age of mass production. Every piece matches the original specifications. Mason walked around the car, checking details that had become as familiar as his own daughter's face. The Mercedes represented more than automotive restoration. It was proof that Edgar's vision could work, that traditional skills could create something both beautiful and economically valuable. The garage itself had been transformed as well. What had once been Edgar's private workshop was now a functioning educational facility. Local teenagers worked alongside retired craftsmen, learning skills that no school curriculum could teach. The town council had formally established the Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute, with Mason as its director and the car collection as its living curriculum. But success hadn't come without challenges. Colt Harrington had made good on his threats, hiring lawyers to challenge the insurance policy and lobbyists to pressure state officials for regulatory changes that would force the collection sale. Every week brought new legal maneuvers, new attempts to find loopholes in Edgar's carefully constructed plan. "Any word from the lawyers?" Ellie asked, emerging from the garage office where she'd been coordinating the concours entry paperwork. In the months since the town meeting, she'd become Mason's closest ally and the Institute's unofficial historian. "Jennifer Walsh thinks we're safe for now," Mason replied. "But Harrington's not giving up. He's convinced the collection is worth more than the insurance payout, and he wants his clients to have it." Ray Kowalski looked up from the electrical system he'd been fine-tuning. "Let him try. This car's going to show the world what Iron Ridge can do." The Mercedes would be judged against the finest restored automobiles in the world, evaluated by experts who could spot flaws invisible to ordinary eyes. Best of show at Pebble Beach was the automotive equivalent of an Olympic gold medal, and the prize money along with the prestige would secure the Heritage Institute's future permanently. "Daddy, can I help?" Leah appeared at Mason's elbow, wearing miniature coveralls that Ellie had sewn for her. At 9, she'd become the project's unofficial mascot, her enthusiasm infectious among the older volunteers. "What do you think we should check next?" Mason asked, knowing that Leah's observations were often surprisingly acute. She walked around the car with the same careful attention the adults showed, her small hands tracing lines and examining details. "The chrome on the bumpers could be brighter," she said finally, "and maybe we should polish the wheels one more time." Tom chuckled. "The kid's got good eyes. Ray, you want to handle the chrome work?" As the team dispersed to handle final preparations, Mason found himself alone with the Mercedes, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 months ago, he'd been a struggling mechanic with no prospects and diminishing hope. Now he was responsible for a multi-million-dollar collection and the economic future of an entire town. The pressure was enormous. If the Mercedes didn't win at Pebble Beach, the Institute would struggle to generate enough revenue to remain viable. The insurance payout would still protect the collection, but Edgar's dream of using it to revitalize Iron Ridge would remain unrealized. "Second thoughts?" Ellie appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who understood the weight on his shoulders. "Every day," Mason admitted. "What if we're not good enough? What if 8 months of work isn't enough to compete against teams that have been doing this for decades? Then we'll try again next year, and the year after that, if necessary." Ellie handed him the coffee and settled against the workbench. Edgar waited 50 years for the right person to carry out his plan. I don't think he expected immediate success. Mason studied the Mercedes, noting the way afternoon light played across its perfectly restored surfaces. "Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of what we've done, whether we're honoring his vision or destroying it. I think he'd be proud. You've brought his cars back to life, given them purpose beyond just preservation. That's what he always wanted." The garage door chimed, and Mason looked up to see a familiar but unwelcome figure entering. Richard Pemberton, the collector who'd made the first offer for Edgar's cars, approached with the cautious demeanor of someone entering potentially hostile territory. "Mr. Duarte," Pemberton said, nodding politely to Mason and Ellie. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how the restoration was progressing." Mason gestured toward the Mercedes. See for yourselves. Pemberton walked around the car with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of classic automobiles. His expression remained neutral, but Mason caught subtle signs of approval, a slight nod at the paint quality, a closer examination of the interior stitching, careful attention to the engine bay's presentation. Impressive work, Pemberton admitted finally. Professional quality in every detail. Your team has genuine talent. Thank you. Of course, talent alone doesn't guarantee success at Pebble Beach. The competition will be fierce, and some of the other entries have been in preparation for years. Mason felt his jaw tighten. Are you here to wish us luck, or to remind us of the odds against us? Pemberton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Actually, I'm here to make one final offer. My clients are still interested in the collection, and they're prepared to be significantly more generous than before. He pulled out a folded document. $200 million for the complete collection, plus an additional $50 million for the garage property and associated assets. Transfer within 30 days. No complications, no legal challenges. Mason stared at the number, feeling the familiar vertigo that came with contemplating such vast sums. $250 million would solve every problem Iron Ridge had ever faced. Would give every family in town financial security beyond their wildest dreams. The offer expires Sunday night, Pemberton continued. After that, my clients will pursue other opportunities. And of course, if your Pebble Beach entry doesn't succeed well, insurance policies can be complicated things. Legal challenges have a way of dragging on for years. After Pemberton left, Mason stood in the garage surrounded by the evidence of 8 months of dedicated work. The Mercedes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every surface reflecting the countless hours of labor that had gone into its restoration. You're not seriously considering his offer, Ellie said, reading his expression. I'm considering whether I have the right to risk everyone's future on a car show. Mason ran his hand along the Mercedes fender, feeling the perfect smoothness of paint that had been applied with techniques perfected over decades. $250 million, Ellie. That's life-changing money for every person in this town. And what happens after they spend it? What happens when the money runs out and there's nothing left but empty bank accounts and regrets? Mason knew she was right, but the weight of responsibility was crushing. Edgar had made his choice 50 years ago, deciding to preserve rather than profit. Now Mason had to make the same choice, but with the added pressure of knowing that other people's lives hung in the balance. The garage door opened again, and Tom Bradley entered carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile Mason had seen since the project began. Just got off the phone with the concours organizers, Tom announced. We're confirmed for the competition, August 15th, Class 5, G, European sports cars, 1,951,960. We're going to Pebble Beach. The team gathered around Tom, their excitement palpable despite the exhaustion of months of intensive work. Frank DiMaggio produced glasses from somewhere, and Ray Kowalski insisted on making a toast. To Edgar Duarte, Ray said, raising his glass toward the underground vault, where the rest of the collection waited patiently. Who taught us that some treasures are worth more than money? To Iron Ridge, added Miguel Santos. And to proving that good work speaks for itself. To the future, Tom Bradley finished, his eyes bright with the same hope that had sustained him through decades of disappointment. Mason raised his glass with the others, but his mind was already racing ahead to Pebble Beach, to the moment when judges would evaluate not just a restored car, but the dreams of an entire community. In less than 5 months, Edgar's 50-year plan would face its ultimate test. Either the Mercedes would prove worthy of the world's most prestigious automotive competition, or Mason would have to find another way to honor a dead man's vision, while securing his neighbor's future. The champagne tasted like victory and defeat in equal measure. The morning of August 15th dawned clear and bright over Monterey Bay, with a kind of California sunshine that made everything look like a postcard. Mason stood in the parking area behind the Pebble Beach Lodge, watching as Tom Bradley and Ray Kowalski performed their final checks on the Mercedes 300 SL. Engine temperature perfect. Oil pressure steady, Tom reported, his voice betraying none of the nervousness Mason felt churning in his stomach. She's ready. The past week had been a blur of preparation and anxiety. The team had driven the Mercedes from Iron Ridge in a custom trailer, every mile monitored and analyzed to ensure the car arrived in perfect condition. They'd rented a small house in nearby Carmel, transforming it into a temporary headquarters where last-minute details could be addressed without the pressure of curious spectators. Now, as Mason looked across the staging area at the other entries, he felt the full weight of what they were attempting. Gleaming Ferraris, prepared by teams from Italy, Porsches restored by German specialists who'd learned their craft at the original factories, Jaguars maintained by British artisans, whose families had been working on those cars for generations. Second thoughts? Ellie asked, appearing at his side with a cup of coffee and wearing the official Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute polo shirt she'd designed for the event. More like 100 thoughts, Mason admitted. Look at this competition, Ellie. These people have resources we can't imagine. Experience will never match. Ellie followed his gaze to a pristine Ferrari 250 GT being fussed over by a team of 6 specialists, each one focused on a different aspect of the car's presentation. They have money and experience. She agreed. But we have something they don't. What's that? Heart, purpose, a reason to win that goes beyond personal prestige. Leah appeared from behind the Mercedes, her face bright with excitement, despite the early hour. She'd insisted on coming to Pebble Beach, and Mason hadn't had the heart to deny her the chance to see Edgar's plan reach its culmination. The judges are coming, she announced, pointing toward a group of distinguished-looking men and women making their way down the line of cars. Mason's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment that would determine whether 8 months of work had been worth the effort. He watched as the judges approached each vehicle with the careful attention of art critics examining a museum exhibition. Judge Patricia Whitman, a legendary figure in automotive restoration circles, stalked in front of the Mercedes with the kind of expression that revealed nothing. She was joined by Dr. Heinrich Müller, whose expertise in German automotive engineering was internationally recognized, and James Crawford, whose restoration business in England had been serving collectors for 40 years. "Good morning," Dr. Müller said in his precise accent. "This is the entry from the Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute?" "Yes, sir," Mason replied, stepping forward with the documentation folder they'd prepared. "I'm Mason Duarte, the Institute's director." Judge Whitman began her examination, starting with the exterior paint and working methodically around the vehicle. Her poker face never wavered as she checked panel gaps, examined chrome trim, and studied the condition of rubber seals that most people would never notice. "The paintwork is exceptional," she noted, making marks on her scorecard. "Original color specification?" "Yes, ma'am. DB 180 silver with red interior, exactly as it left the factory in 1955. Dr. Müller had moved to the engine bay, where his expert eye evaluated everything from the cleanliness of the valve covers to the authenticity of small components that casual observers might miss. "Interesting restoration philosophy," he commented. "You've preserved original finishes where possible, rather than refinishing everything to new condition. Very respectful of the car's history." James Crawford was examining the interior with the intensity of a surgeon, checking stitching patterns, material authenticity, and the countless details that separated amateur work from professional restoration. "The leather work is particularly impressive," he said. "Hand-stitched using period-correct techniques. Where did you find craftsmen with these skills?" "We trained them," Tom Bradley answered, stepping forward with quiet pride. "Local workers learning traditional methods." For the first time, Judge Whitman showed a flicker of genuine interest. "You trained them. How long has your institute been operational?" 8 months, Mason replied, watching her eyebrows rise slightly. "This restoration was our first major project." The judges exchanged glances, and Mason felt his heart sink. 8 months wasn't nearly enough time to establish credibility in a field where some restoration shops had been operating for decades. Ambitious, Dr. Mueller said diplomatically. Very ambitious indeed. They spent another 10 minutes examining details: the condition of the spare tire, the authenticity of toolkits, the operation of mechanical systems that most modern cars had replaced with electronics. Each inspection felt like a test that Mason wasn't sure they were passing. Finally, Judge Whitman closed her folder and looked directly at Mason. "Thank you, Mr. Duarte. We'll complete our evaluation of all entries and announce the winners this afternoon." As the judges moved on to the next car, Mason felt his knees go weak. The professional politeness, the diplomatic comments, the careful avoidance of any definitive statements, it all suggested that the Mercedes, despite 8 months of passionate work, might not be competitive against the world's finest restorations. "How do you think we did?" Leah asked, slipping her hand into his. Mason squeezed her fingers gently, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We did our best, sweetheart. Sometimes that's all you can do." But as he watched the judges examining the competition, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that their best might not be good enough. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine grass of Pebble Beach as hundreds of spectators gathered around the awards platform. Mason stood with his team near the Mercedes, trying to project calm, while his heart hammered against his ribs. 8 months of work, Edgar's 50-year vision, and Iron Ridge's economic future all hung in the balance of the next 30 minutes. Leah pressed close to his side, her small hand finding his. She'd been unusually quiet since lunch, perhaps sensing the tension that had gripped the adults throughout the judging process. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice carried clearly across the field, "welcome to the award ceremony for the 70th annual Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance." The ceremony began with smaller awards: Best Engine Bay, Most Authentic Restoration, People's Choice. Each announcement brought polite applause and the kind of dignified celebration appropriate to such a refined event. Mason noted which cars were being recognized, trying to gauge where the Mercedes might stand in the judges' estimation. "The award for most innovative use of traditional techniques," the announcer continued, "goes to the Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute for their 1,955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing." Mason felt his knees go weak with relief. It wasn't the best of show award they needed, but it was recognition that their approach had merit, that 8 months of passionate work had produced something worthy of respect. Tom Bradley clapped him on the shoulder. "That's a start, son. That's a real good start." As the ceremony continued, tension built toward the announcement of class winners. The Mercedes competed in European sports cars, 1,951,960, one of the most prestigious categories, with some of the finest restored automobiles in the world. Third place in Class 5, G, the announcer called out. The 1,957 Ferrari 250 GT Tour de France, owned by the Martinelli collection. Polite applause. Mason's heart rate increased. Second place in Class 5, G, the 1,958 Porsche 356 Speedster, restored by Gunther Automotive Restoration. More applause. Mason could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the ocean breeze. And first place in Class 5, G, representing an outstanding example of community-based restoration excellence, the 1,955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing from the Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute. The words hit Mason like a physical blow. They'd won their class. Against international competition, against teams with decades of experience, against restoration shops with unlimited resources, a group of unemployed steelworkers and a struggling mechanic had produced the finest example in their category. The team erupted in celebration, Frank DiMaggio letting out a whoop that could probably be heard back in Iron Ridge, Ray Kowalski pumping his fist in the air, Miguel Santos crossing himself and muttering prayers of gratitude in Spanish. But Mason's attention was focused on the announcer, who was now preparing to announce the overall best of show winner. This was the moment that mattered, the award that came with prize money sufficient to secure the Heritage Institute's future permanently. This year's competition has been particularly strong, the announcer said, with exceptional entries representing the finest in automotive restoration from around the world. The judges faced difficult decisions in every category. Mason found himself holding his breath. Around him, hundreds of spectators waited with the same anticipation, though for most of them, this was entertainment rather than a matter of survival. The Best of Show award goes to an entry that exemplifies not just technical excellence, but the spirit of preservation and education that makes this event meaningful. The announcer paused, seeming to savor the moment. The 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, restored by the Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute. For a moment, Mason thought he'd misheard. The words seemed to echo in his head without quite making sense. Then Leah was jumping up and down beside him. Tom was hugging him so hard his ribs creaked, and Ellie was crying openly while trying to take pictures with hands that shook too much to hold the camera steady. They'd won. Against all odds, against overwhelming competition, against the skepticism of experts who dismissed them as well-meaning amateurs, they'd won the most prestigious award in automotive restoration. As Mason walked toward the platform to accept the Best of Show trophy, he thought about Edgar, whose vision had made this moment possible. The old man had waited 50 years for someone to understand what he was trying to accomplish, had preserved his collection through decades of solitude and secrecy, trusting that eventually the right person would come along to carry out his plan. Judge Patricia Whitman presented the trophy with a smile that transformed her stern face completely. Congratulations, Mr. Duarte. This restoration represents something special, not just technical skill, but genuine passion for preserving automotive history while building community. Mason accepted the trophy, its weight solid and reassuring in his hands. Thank you. This award belongs to everyone who believed in Edgar Duarte's vision. We understand this project has broader implications beyond the car itself, Dr. Mueller added. The judges were particularly impressed by your institute's educational mission and community focus. That's exactly the kind of initiative our industry needs to support. As Mason returned to his team, trophy in hand, he found himself surrounded by congratulatory strangers, reporters asking for interviews, and collectors expressing interest in visiting Iron Ridge to see the rest of Edgar's collection. But the moment that meant the most came when Leah looked up at him with eyes shining with pride and said, "Daddy, Uncle Edgar would be so happy." Mason knelt down to her level, the trophy between them catching the late afternoon light. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he would be." The prize money would cover the Heritage Institute's operating expenses for the next 5 years, giving them time to establish sustainable revenue streams and expand their educational programs. Edgar's insurance policy would remain intact, protecting the collection while allowing it to serve its intended purpose. Iron Ridge had its future back, built not on the sale of its treasures, but on the preservation of its heritage and the renewal of its pride. As the sun set over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mason held the Best of Show trophy and felt the weight of responsibility transform into the lightness of accomplishment. Edgar's 50-year plan had finally come to fruition, proving that some dreams are worth waiting for. 1 year later, Mason stood in the same spot where Edgar's garage had once hidden its secrets, but everything had changed. The underground vault was now brightly lit and accessible by a proper staircase. Its climate-controlled environment protecting 36 cars, while the Mercedes 300 SL held place of honor in the main gallery above. The Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute had exceeded everyone's expectations. Students came from 3 states to learn traditional restoration techniques from craftsmen who'd perfected their skills on the mill floor. The rotating display of Edgar's collection drew thousands of visitors annually, their admission fees and gift shop purchases supporting not just the institute, but dozens of local businesses that had reopened to serve the influx of automotive enthusiasts. "Daddy, Look what I made, Leah called out from the student workshop, where she was participating in the Institute's junior program. At 10, she could identify automotive components that stumped college students, and her latest projector working model of a differential gear system demonstrated an understanding of mechanical principles that would have impressed Edgar himself. Mason examined her work with the pride of a father and the critical eye of an educator. Perfect tolerances, smooth operation, and excellent documentation. You're ready for the intermediate program. Leah beamed with satisfaction, then returned to her workbench, where she was helping a group of visiting high school students understand how transmission systems functioned. She moved among them with the confidence of someone who'd grown up surrounded by automotive history, explaining complex concepts in the simple language that made learning enjoyable. The Institute's success had transformed more than just the building. Tom Bradley now served as head instructor, his decades of experience finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Ray Kowalski managed the electrical systems curriculum, while Frank DiMaggio taught welding and metalwork to students who understood they were learning arts that might otherwise disappear. Miguel Santos had perhaps benefited most from the transformation. His precision machining skills, unused since the mill closure, were now in constant demand as students learned to fabricate components for restoration projects. He'd hired 2 assistants and was planning to expand his workshop to handle the growing number of requests from collectors nationwide. Mr. Duarte? A voice interrupted Mason's thoughts. He turned to see a young woman in her 20s, wearing the kind of professional attire that suggested serious intent. I'm Rebecca Chen from the National Automotive Heritage Foundation. We'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity. Mason had learned to be cautious about partnership opportunities. Success had brought attention from organizations that wanted to associate themselves with the Institute's prestige, not all of them motivated by educational goals. What kind of partnership? We're developing a national network of heritage automotive centers, places that preserve both cars and the skills needed to maintain them. Your institute would be perfect as our flagship location in the Midwest. Rebecca outlined a program that would provide federal funding for expansion, establish exchange programs with similar institutions internationally, and create scholarship opportunities for students who couldn't otherwise afford the training. There would be no changes to your current programs, she assured him. The Foundation's role would be purely supportive, providing resources and connections that would help you reach more students. Mason found himself thinking about Edgar, wondering what the old man would have made of such opportunities. The Heritage Institute had grown beyond Edgar's original vision, but it remained true to his core principles, preserving the past while building the future, honoring tradition while embracing innovation. I'll need to discuss it with our board, Mason said finally. The Institute's governance structure included representatives from the town council, the student body, and the volunteer instructors, ensuring that major decisions reflected community interests rather than individual preferences. After Rebecca left, Mason walked through the main gallery where Edgar's cars were displayed with the respect they deserved. Each vehicle was accompanied by detailed information about its history, its significance to automotive development, and its role in Edgar's collection. Visitors often spent hours reading the stories, understanding that they were experiencing more than just expensive automobiles. They were witnessing the evolution of human craftsmanship and ingenuity. The bronze dedication plaque near the entrance had been installed 6 months after Pebble Beach, paid for by donations from grateful townspeople who understood what Edgar's vision had meant to their community. Its simple inscription captured the essence of what they'd accomplished. Iron Ridge Automotive Heritage Institute, dedicated to Edgar Duarte, 1925, 2023. Who understood that some treasures gain value when shared, and that the finest restoration is the renewal of hope? Ellie Park appeared beside him, carrying the day's visitor log, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose work was making a difference. As the Institute's curator and educational coordinator, she documented every aspect of Edgar's collection, while developing programs that made automotive history accessible to visitors of all ages. Busy day, she reported. 342 visitors, including a group from the Smithsonian who want to discuss a traveling exhibition featuring Edgar's cars. Mason smiled at the irony. Edgar had spent 50 years hiding his collection from the world, and now that same collection was being courted by the nation's most prestigious museums. Any word from Colt Harrington lately? Ellie's expression darkened slightly. His lawyers withdrew their final appeal last month. The insurance policy's validity has been confirmed at every level, and the Heritage Institute's educational mission satisfies all the requirements for maintaining the payout. Harrington had never given up completely, spending more than a year challenging Edgar's legal arrangements and trying to find ways to force the collection's sale. But Edgar's planning had been too thorough, his documentation too complete, his vision too clearly articulated to be overturned by legal technicalities. He's moved on to other opportunities, Ellie continued. Apparently there's a collection of vintage aircraft in Montana that he thinks has potential. As the day's last visitors departed, and the Institute settled into evening quiet, Mason found himself in Edgar's restored office, which had been preserved exactly as the old man had left it. The leather-bound ledger still lay open on the desk, its final entry unchanged. Collection complete. Time to prepare for the transfer. Mason picked up a pen and made his own entry below Edgar's final words. Transfer complete. Time to build the future, MD. Outside, Iron Ridge bustled with the kind of activity the town hadn't seen since the mill's heyday. Restaurants served dinner to tourists who'd come to see the cars and stayed to experience small-town hospitality. The old hotel had reopened, its rooms booked months in advance by collectors and students who wanted to spend time where automotive history was being preserved and taught. Leah appeared in the doorway, her coveralls traded for regular clothes, but her hands still bearing the honest stains of someone who worked with tools and understood the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. Ready to go home, Daddy? Mason closed Edgar's ledger and stood up, feeling the weight of a successful day and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. Ready. As they walked through the gallery toward the exit, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a struggling mechanic inheriting what everyone assumed was worthless. Now he was the director of an institution that honored the past while building the future, proving that Edgar's faith in him had been justified. The Mercedes 300 SL gleamed under the gallery lights, its best-of-show trophy displayed proudly nearby. But the real prize wasn't the award or the money. It was the knowledge that Edgar's 50-year dream had finally found its fulfillment in the hands of people who understood its true value. Mason turned off the lights and locked the door, leaving Edgar's collection to rest in the darkness until tomorrow brought new visitors, new students, and new opportunities to share the treasures that had been hidden for so long. Some things, he'd learned, were indeed worth waiting for,